The police lights flashed across Marcus Hale's driveway just minutes after he parked his truck. He stepped out, confused, as two officers walked toward him like he didn't belong there. One officer spoke first. "Sir, we received a report that you're trespassing on HOA property." Marcus blinked slowly. "On what property?" he asked calmly. The officer pointed behind him. Marcus turned and stared at the house he had lived in for 8 years. His house. This moment would eventually reveal a twist the entire neighborhood never saw coming. Because the HOA that called the police believed Marcus had broken their rules, what they didn't realize was that Marcus had already left the HOA months earlier. And even more shocking, they had no idea who actually owned the land around them anymore. Across the street, HOA President Linda Carson stood with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with quiet confidence. She stepped forward. "Officer, he's violating HOA regulations again," she said firmly. "He refuses to follow community rules." Marcus sighed. "I'm not part of your HOA anymore," he replied. Linda gave a small laugh. "Oh yes you are," she said. "And tonight the police are going to make that very clear." But Marcus simply smiled, because the truth about the neighborhood had already changed, and the HOA had absolutely no idea. The biggest surprise wasn't that Marcus left the HOA. The real shock was what he did next, and once the officers heard the full story, everything about that call suddenly felt very different. Marcus Hale had moved into Oak Ridge Meadows nearly a decade earlier. Back then, the neighborhood felt peaceful, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, a community that promised order and stability through its homeowners association. At first, Marcus didn't mind the rules, mowing schedules, mailbox standards, paint colors, nothing unusual. But things changed when Linda Carson became HOA president. Almost overnight, the notices began appearing, warning letters about his truck, fines for leaving tools in the driveway, complaints about landscaping that had been unchanged for years. Marcus tried to cooperate, but the rules kept expanding. Soon it felt like every small detail of his property required permission. Finally, Marcus started researching something important, his original property contract, and that's when he discovered something unusual. A clause buried deep in the documents revealed that his property sat on a section of land originally developed separately from the HOA, meaning something surprising. If he legally separated his lot from the HOA agreement, he could leave the association completely. Most homeowners never noticed this clause, but Marcus did, and after weeks of paperwork, legal filings, and county verification, he officially withdrew his property from the HOA. He thought that would be the end of the conflict, but Linda Carson didn't see it that way. In her mind, no one simply left the HOA, so she made a decision. If Marcus wouldn't follow the rules, she would force him to, even if it meant calling the police. Back in the driveway, the officers listened carefully as Marcus explained everything. He spoke calmly. "No disrespect to the HOA," Marcus said, "but I'm not part of it anymore." Linda shook her head immediately. "That's impossible," she insisted. "Every house here is under HOA authority." Marcus reached into his truck and pulled out a folder. Inside were several stamped county documents. He handed them to the officer. "These confirm my property withdrawal," he explained. The officer studied the papers. Linda leaned closer. "That can't be right," she said, "but the documents were official." The officer nodded slowly. "These appear valid." Linda's confidence slipped for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Even if that's true," she said, "he's still violating HOA community space." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Community space?" he repeated. Linda pointed toward the row of houses behind Marcus's property. The surrounding lots still belong to the HOA. Marcus paused, then he gave a quiet chuckle, and that reaction confused everyone. Because Marcus wasn't nervous, he looked amused. The officer noticed. "Is there something we're missing here?" he asked. Marcus glanced at the neighborhood streets stretching behind him. "Well," he said slowly, "that depends on whether anyone here has checked the property records recently." Linda frowned. "What does that mean?" Marcus folded his arms. "Let's just say," he replied calmly, "the HOA might want to review who owns the land around here now." And suddenly the situation didn't feel so simple anymore. The officer looked at Marcus carefully. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked. Marcus opened the folder again and removed another document. But this one was different. It wasn't about leaving the HOA, it was a property purchase record. 6 months ago, Marcus explained, the developer who originally owned several unsold lots decided to sell. Linda interrupted immediately. "Yes, those lots are still inside the HOA." Marcus nodded slowly. "They were." He handed the paper to the officer, but the developer didn't sell them to the HOA. The officer scanned the document, his eyebrows lifted slightly. Linda stepped closer. "Who bought them?" she demanded. Marcus smiled. I did. Silence filled the street. The officer looked up from the paper. These records show multiple lots purchased under your name. Linda stared at Marcus. That's not possible, she whispered. But the officer continued reading. Lots 12 through 21, he said. Marcus nodded again. And if you check the neighborhood map, he added, you'll notice something interesting. Linda felt a sudden unease, because those lots surrounded the center of the neighborhood, including the street behind Marcus's house. The officer looked at the map, then he looked at Linda. Well, he said slowly, this changes things quite a bit. Because the HOA believed they controlled the entire block. But according to the records, Marcus now owned most of it, and the realization was only just beginning. Word spread quickly across Oak Ridge Meadows. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, watching the conversation unfold near Marcus's driveway. Linda's confidence had completely vanished. You bought those lots? She asked. Marcus nodded calmly. They were vacant for years, he explained. The developer finally decided to sell them. And you bought all of them? She asked. Yes. Linda glanced down the street. Because those lots weren't just empty land, they formed the entire center section of the neighborhood. The officer folded the documents. If these records are correct, he said, then Mr. Hale owns most of this block. A quiet murmur spread through the small crowd. Linda's voice tightened. But those lots are still HOA territory. Marcus shook his head gently. Not anymore. The officer pointed at the document again. These purchases legally transferred ownership, he explained, and since Mr. Hale is no longer part of the HOA, those properties aren't governed by the association. Linda looked stunned. For years, the HOA had enforced rules across the neighborhood without question, but now a large portion of that land belonged to someone completely outside their control. Marcus watched the realization slowly spread. Because he hadn't bought those lots to cause trouble, he had bought them for something else, something the HOA still hadn't realized, and when he finally revealed his plan, the entire neighborhood would see this situation in a completely different way. The crowd slowly grew larger as neighbors stepped outside to hear the news. Linda struggled to regain control of the situation. This doesn't change the HOA rules, she insisted. Marcus raised an eyebrow. It changes quite a few things actually. The officer nodded slightly. If the land belongs to Mr. Hale, the HOA has limited authority there. Linda looked toward the surrounding lots. For years the HOA planned to develop those spaces with new houses and community areas, but now they belong to Marcus. What exactly do you plan to do with them? She asked cautiously. Marcus looked around the neighborhood, snow-covered lawns, quiet streets, families watching from their front doors. Then he smiled. I'm not building anything, he said. Linda blinked in confusion. You're not? Marcus shook his head. No, he pointed toward the open land behind the houses. I'm turning the entire block into a public green park. The neighbors looked stunned. Walking trails, open space, community gardens, places for kids to play, Marcus continued. And because it won't be HOA property, it'll be open for everyone. Linda said nothing, because suddenly the person she tried to remove from the neighborhood had just improved it for everyone, and the final twist was still waiting. Within weeks, the transformation began. Construction crews cleared pathways across the open lots Marcus had purchased. Neighbors watched as benches, walking trails, and small gardens slowly appeared. What was once empty land became something the neighborhood had never had before, a peaceful green space. Families started visiting every afternoon. Children rode bikes along the new paths. Neighbors gathered on benches and talked for hours. And because the land belonged to Marcus, not the HOA, there were no rules about who could enjoy it. Even Linda Carson eventually walked through the park one quiet evening. Marcus happened to be there, checking on the new trees being planted. She approached him carefully. I may have misjudged you, she admitted. Marcus smiled politely. I just wanted the neighborhood to feel like home again. Linda looked around at the families enjoying the park, and for the first time in a long while, the HOA rules didn't seem nearly as important, because the man they once accused of trespassing had quietly become the person who improved the entire community. Sometimes the biggest conflicts lead to the most unexpected outcomes, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.